He could still hear the laughter. Not the warm kind that fills a room, but the sharp, cutting kind that scrapes against a man's dignity. And in the center of that crowded Moscow gym, beneath the giant banners of Russia's proud Sambo champions, a single sentence sliced through the air as cleanly as any punch. A Filipino like you has no chance here. Have you ever stood in a place where every eye told you that you did not belong? Where the walls themselves seemed to whisper that you were already defeated? That was the moment Miguel Santos found himself in, a moment suspended between humiliation and something else he could not yet name. The Russian fighter who said those words towered over him. Broad shoulders, years of elite training, a face carved with confidence, even arrogance. They called him Viktor Orlov, a Sambo champion who had broken records and bones with the same effortless ease. Around him were coaches, athletes, journalists, people who had already decided that the Filipino man standing barefoot on the mat was nothing more than an amusing footnote. Miguel was smaller, quieter, almost invisible in the sea of towering physiques and cold stares. To them, he looked like someone who came from beaches and fiestas, not rings and cages. They believed Filipinos were friendly, warm, maybe even tough in their own way, but not world-class fighters, not contenders, not threats. And yet he didn't flinch. He didn't look away. Outside the building, snow was falling softly, covering the streets in white silence, while inside him, a storm was forming. Calm, steady, and patient. He didn't need to speak. He didn't need to defend himself. Because the truth, the real truth, was already resting quietly in his chest like a blade waiting to be drawn. What if I told you that the words spoken that day, the mockery, the arrogance, the disbelief, would become one of the greatest mistakes ever made in that gym? This was not a title fight, not a broadcast match, not an arena roaring with thousands of spectators. It was just a training hall, a simple sparring day, a moment most would forget. But for those who witnessed what came next, it would be the moment that forced them to ask a question they had never considered before. Had they been wrong about Filipinos all along? Miguel adjusted his hand wraps slowly, as if preparing for something sacred. Victor kept talking. The others kept laughing. But there was something shifting in the room, something they didn't see yet. A silence beginning to gather around the edges like fog rolling in before a storm. Because this wasn't just about a single sparring match. This wasn't about pride or ego. This was about identity, about a people too often overlooked, too often judged before they are known, too often underestimated by a world that forgets where heart is born. Miguel's eyes lifted toward Victor's for a brief, almost invisible moment. They didn't know it then. They couldn't have known. But the real test was about to make everyone rise to their feet. The room had quieted, but not out of respect. It was the kind of silence that follows a joke, the kind that lingers when people are waiting for the punchline to finish unfolding. In their eyes, Miguel was the punchline. A Filipino in a Russian Sambo hall, standing across from a champion who had dominated tournaments across Europe. To them, this match was nothing more than a warm-up, a curiosity, a harmless mismatch to start the day. People underestimate Filipinos for many reasons, some old, some subtle, some born from a world that measures worth by wealth, size, and geography. In places like Moscow, where athletes grow up in towering facilities and train under national programs, the Philippines is often seen as friendly but small, passionate but underdeveloped, full of heart but lacking the so-called elite systems of the West or the great athletic empires of the East. They didn't see centuries of resilience. They didn't see a culture defined by surviving storms stronger than steel. They saw none of that when they looked at Miguel. What they saw was a man too humble, too polite, too quiet to ever threaten someone like Victor Orlov. And it was in that heavy space of unspoken judgment that Miguel took his first steps onto the mat. He could feel every pair of eyes tracing his movements, waiting for the moment he would stumble. One of the younger trainees whispered loudly enough for half the room to hear, "He will not last a minute." A coach smirked and shook his head, already turning away to speak to someone else, as if preparing for the inevitable. The hurt didn't come from their words, but from their certainty, from the way they had already written the ending before the story even began. Miguel remembered stepping into gyms back home in Manila. Small rooms without air conditioning, concrete floors polished smooth from years of footwork, ceilings low enough that you could hear the rain striking the roof like a drum. Those gyms carried no prestige, no trophies lined the walls, but they carried something else, something unbreakable, something that made hardship feel like fuel. He wondered if they would ever understand that. The first challenge came long before the sparring even began. It came when Victor approached him. The Russian towered above him, arms folded, looking down with a grin carved from pure confidence. "Try not to get hurt," he said in a slow, deliberate tone, like a teacher addressing a child. Miguel simply nodded. No need for words, not yet. As the warm-ups began, he felt the stairs burning into his back. He ran, stretched, shadowed movements, feeling the rhythm of his breath. Victor's footsteps echoed louder across the mats, heavy, certain, powerful. Every motion from the Russian was a performance meant to intimidate. Still, Miguel moved with quiet focus. They didn't know what he carried inside him. The nights he trained after long shifts. The tournaments he fought in barangay gyms where the crowd was so close you could feel their heat. The matches he survived against opponents who were far more dangerous than the polite world of sports ever allowed. They didn't know about the coach who once told him, "Your body will tire, but your spirit, that is where Filipinos are born champions." They didn't know that life had hardened him in ways no elite program could replicate. While the Russian athletes joked in the corner, amused that they would soon witness an easy victory, Miguel tightened his wrap, feeling the texture of the cloth against his skin. The fabric was rough, but familiar, like the feeling of home. Then the moment arrived. The coach clapped his hands, calling the fighters to the mat. Laughter faded into a hush. Shoes shuffled across the floor. Even the air seemed to pause, hanging thick above everyone's heads. Miguel stepped into the center, and as Victor faced him, a smile curled on the Russian's lips, the kind of smile a man wears when he believes he already knows the future. The room waited for failure. The world they grew up in taught them to expect it, but the truth, still hidden, still quiet, still waiting, was that they had misread everything. The coach lowered his hand to signal the start. Every eye turned to Miguel. This was the moment they thought he would break. But he did something no one expected. The signal dropped like a pin in a cathedral. A soft gesture, almost insignificant, yet it carried the entire weight of a room filled with expectation. Victor stepped forward first, confident, relaxed, almost bored. Miguel followed, quiet as a breath. And in that instant, in the tiny space between their movements, something changed, though no one could explain why. Miguel's posture wasn't aggressive. He didn't rush. He didn't tense. He simply settled into position with a stillness so controlled that the closest observers felt a strange unease creeping into their spine. Victor noticed it too, though he didn't admit it. Instead, he chuckled and raised his hands, signaling what he believed would be a quick lesson in dominance. But the lesson was not his to teach. The first touch between them wasn't a strike, wasn't a shove. but a single moment of contact where Miguel's hand met Victor's wrist. A gesture so small it nearly went unseen. Yet somehow, the room felt the air shift, the same way the wind changes right before a storm breaks open across the sky. Then Miguel moved. It wasn't explosive. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't even fast in the way most expect speed to look. It was precise, sharp in angles, fluid in timing, so economical that it stunned the senses. He redirected Victor's grip with the ease of someone turning a page, letting the Russian's own weight pull him forward for a split second. A fraction of a moment. A blink. That was all it took for the laughter to stop. Victor's grin faltered. No one understood what they were seeing. The champion tried to recover, tried to reassert control. But Miguel's flow was different from anything they had trained against. It carried the rhythm of Manila gyms, the improvisation of street tournaments, the instinct honed in crowded rings where space was limited and creativity was survival. What he displayed was not textbook Sambo, not by their standards. It was something deeper, something lived, something earned through years of discipline that never needed applause to grow. Miguel pivoted again, this time guiding Victor's arm downward with a sensitivity that startled the Russian. It was as if he could feel each muscle fiber, anticipate every reaction a full heartbeat before it happened. Victor stepped back, no longer amused. The confidence in his eyes shifted into something colder, focused, alert. And then the room changed. The joking trainees straightened their backs. Coaches leaned forward. Even the journalist who had nearly left the room paused mid-step. Silence traveled from wall to wall like a slow-moving wave. They were witnessing a man they mocked begin to dismantle assumptions they had carried for years. The spark had become visible. Miguel continued with movements that were both humble and breathtaking. No ego, no theatrics, just truth in motion. Every technique was clean, economical, and born from a lifetime of effort unseen by the world. The Russian champion tried to push him, force him, overpower him, but each time Miguel redirected with such quiet strength that Victor found himself reacting rather than controlling. People began exchanging glances, confused at first, then curious, then something close to respect. One coach whispered, "What is he doing?" Another replied softly, "I don't know, but it's working." The man who had mocked Miguel the loudest earlier stood up from the bench, hands resting on his knees, eyes narrowing as if trying to solve a puzzle that refused to stay still. And in that moment, he realized this wasn't luck. This wasn't accident. This was skill honed beyond their expectations. But Miguel wasn't done. He hadn't shown his strongest technique yet. He hadn't revealed what made him different, what made him Filipino in a way no one in this gym had ever encountered. The shift in the room had only just begun. Because what happened next would flip the entire place upside down. Victor stepped in again, this time with real force. No more smiles, no more belittling amusement. His shoulders tightened, his breath sharpened, and the muscles in his arms swelled as he prepared to end the exchange with the decisive strength he was known for. The room braced itself, expecting Miguel to finally fold beneath the weight of a European champion's full power. But the collapse never came. Instead, Miguel shifted, just a single subtle movement of his hips, a fractional tilt in balance, a soft step that barely made a sound. And in that whisper of movement, Victor's grip missed its mark. His momentum carried him forward, exactly where Miguel wanted him. What followed happened too fast for the untrained eye, yet too beautifully for the trained ones to forget. Miguel spun. It was not a dramatic, cinematic flourish. It was clean, controlled, almost surgical. A pivot drawn from years of grinding in tight Filipino gyms where technique had to be born from necessity, not luxury. His hand locked onto Victor's arm with a precision that felt like destiny unfolding. His weight shifted downward. Gravity joined him, and Victor, Russia's pride, their champion, was lifted off the mat. For a breathless moment, the giant hung in the air, suspended by a man they once mocked. Then the entire room shook as Victor hit the mat with a thud that silenced every lingering doubt. No one moved. No one spoke. Even the snow outside seemed to pause mid-fall. Miguel didn't celebrate. He didn't pump his fists or look around for approval. He simply stepped back, breathing steadily, eyes calm. As if what he had just done was nothing more than the natural consequence of truth finally revealing itself. The Russian coaches exchanged looks of disbelief. One placed a hand over his mouth. Another slowly removed his headset, unable to comprehend that the man they dismissed as a warm-up partner had just executed a technique that demanded mastery, timing, and fearlessness far beyond average fighters. Victor stood up, shaken, not in anger, but in realization. His pride had fractured, not from humiliation, but from the undeniable truth that he had underestimated not just a man, but a whole people. The room, still frozen in awe, watched as he approached Miguel again. But this time there was no grin, no arrogance, no shadow of mockery. Victor bowed his head slightly, a gesture small in size, gigantic in meaning. "You are stronger than I thought," he said, voice low, accented, sincere. Miguel nodded, almost shyly. Humility, an instinct Filipinos carry like breath, softened the entire exchange. But Victor wasn't finished. He turned to the room, pointing at Miguel. "This man fights with heart I have never seen." The words rippled through the gym. For the first time, they truly looked at Miguel. Not the stereotype, not the expectation, but the fighter. The Filipino. The man who stood tall not because of his size, but because of the spirit that shaped him. The applause came slowly at first, hesitant, like a world reconsidering everything it thought it knew. Then another pair of hands joined. Then another. Soon, the entire room was clapping. Not out of politeness, but out of respect born from clarity. In that sound, heavy and rising, something deeper unfolded. Because Miguel's victory was not just about technique. It was about the story written into every Filipino who has been dismissed, underestimated, or told they were not enough. It was about resilience formed by struggles the world never sees. About the quiet strength found in families who rise after every storm. About a nation whose greatest weapon has always been its heart. A heart that refuses to quit. A heart that learns in silence and fights with purpose. A heart the world often overlooks, until it is too late. One of the foreign coaches approached Miguel afterward, extending a hand. "If this is Filipino training," he said softly, "then truly, the world has a lot to learn." Miguel accepted the handshake, not as a victor, not as a conqueror, but as a Filipino who had just reminded the world of something it should never forget. And from that moment on, the story no longer belonged to him alone. It belonged to an entire nation.